everyone, and I will bail out of your way. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I want to welcome you guys to our luncheon. I want to thank our presidential sponsors of the Chamber. I would also like to welcome all of our special guests, and I'd like to recognize all of our Chamber board members. If you guys would please just stand up. So I am Lynn Faulkner. I am the Chamber's Education Chairman. I'm also the Executive Director for the Kentucky Association of Master Contractors. We represent plumbing and HVAC contractors throughout the state. So if you need any heat and air or plumbing, let me know. I can hook you up. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Secretary of State Michael Adams. Secretary is a native of Paducah, Kentucky. He is the 86th Secretary of the State and the 77th person to serve in this role. Michael attended McCracken County Public Schools and was the first in his family to earn a bachelor's degree. After graduating from the University of Louisville, Michael attended Harvard Law School on a low-income aid. Michael clerked for the Chief U.S. District Judge Hayburn. He worked on Senator Mitch McConnell's 2002 re-election campaign and served as Deputy General Counsel to Governor Ernie Fletcher. He was appointed as counsel to the U.S. Deputy Attorney General in the second Bush administration. In 2016, Michael was appointed to the Kentucky State Board of Elections and became Secretary of State on January 6, 2020. Michael is happily married to Christina and is the proud father of Lucia.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much. The proud father of Lucia, who actually is with us today, no school right now, so she's able to join Dad on the trail. I'm so grateful to y'all, not just for inviting me here, but inviting me here at your first in-person gathering in some time. That's really special. I'm also grateful that you included Jeff Hancock as part of this for two reasons. One, I really like Jeff, and we work together really well. He's one of our outstanding clerks. The other reason is it's a really good point that you're noting, I think silently, that this is not a one-person show. I sit in my office in the Capitol and come up with all kinds of ideas, some good, some not. But it's the clerks that actually have to implement this on the ground level. I'm not actually the person who runs the election. There is no such thing. We have 120 clerks running 120 elections. We're just there for support. It's really Jeff and the others on the ground that run these elections. And so it's a really good point, I think, having both of us here to talk about election reform from our different perspectives. Let me start with this, sort of a progress report on 2020. Thank God it's over. We survived, and we did even better than that. We thrived. We became not just a survivor, but in fact, a national leader in election administration and election reform. And I wish on some level, I actually wish I didn't have that to say, because I'd like to see other states have done better and be doing better now. But the fact is, Kentucky really is alone as a leader on these issues. Let's start with the election itself. Against all odds and all expectations, we had a safe and a secure and a successful election in 2020. It was safe. Unlike what you saw in some other states, we didn't have a spike in COVID cases coming out of our elections. Despite millions of people going to vote in person, we didn't have a spike. We had certainly spikes coming out of other things, holidays and so forth in 2020, but not out of our elections. And that's just another huge testament to the work of our clerks on the ground, implementing the procedures. It's also a statement on our people in Kentucky. They followed the rules, they distanced, they masked, and all the other stuff that helped us keep COVID from becoming an issue in our election the way it did in some other states. It wasn't obvious that we were going to be able to pull that off, but we did. We kept the public safe, and we didn't let a virus disenfranchise anybody. We had a secure election. When you're in the middle, like Jeff or me, maybe more so me on this stuff, you've got folks on extreme ends of the spectrum. On one extreme end, everything is always vote suppression all the time. That's not really the truth, but that's how they see it. On the other side, everything's all fraud all the time. And there's a grain of truth there. You do have actual suppression. You do have actual fraud, but it's at the margins. It's not a daily occurrence. A lot of folks thought that the procedures that we implemented last year for the pandemic were going to lead to mass fraud in our elections, and it just didn't happen. We actually had a more secure election than we had had previously under the old rules that I inherited from the 1890s that had never been updated in 130 years. So we had a secure election. People's votes counted. And we had a successful election. If you had told me we were going to have the highest turnout in our state history in 2020 when I got sworn in, I may or may not have believed you. If you had told me it was going to be in the context of a pandemic, I absolutely would not have believed you. But we did. We had the highest number of voters ever vote in a Kentucky election in a pandemic of all times. So coming out of that process, after we took a deep breath and said a prayer of thanksgiving for surviving this process and performing so well, the next obvious step for us on my team was to assess what were the things that we did on a temporary basis that would translate well on a permanent basis. To be sure, there were some things that we did that we will never do again. But there are other things that actually translated well to non-pandemic elections. So the first thing that I did, naturally enough, was to survey the county clerks. My team asked all 120 county clerks to give us feedback on things they did and didn't like from how we ran the election in 2020. And let me digress for a second. When I ran for office in 2019, actually 2018 also, I spent 2 years traveling the state. I drove 50,000 miles around the earth twice, just within Kentucky. When I was able to, I always would stop in the clerk's office, Democrats or Republicans, and just chat with them. And pretty much universally, the clerks all told me, we don't want early voting. We don't like it, we don't want it. Ironically, coming out of 2020, the clerks strongly supported early voting. They loved it. Their constituents loved it, but also the clerks loved it. And I'll get into that in just a moment. So we surveyed the clerks. Again, they run the elections on the ground. I wanted to see what they thought. I would certainly not approach the legislature with plans for permanent legislation without working with them first. There was a lot of consensus. This is one of the most polarizing fields in policy as you've seen election issues. You see that in DC. You see that in other states. In Kentucky, it really hasn't been. We really haven't had that sort of polarization. It's just been sort of a common sense assessment of what works and doesn't. And it's been done intentionally in a bipartisan way, not just between me and the governor, but also between the Democratic and Republican members of the Board of Elections, between the Democratic and Republican clerks. Every single precinct in Kentucky where you vote has at least one D and one R. We've got a uniquely bipartisan approach to this stuff, which doesn't mean we agree on everything, but it does mean that we can work it out in a civil way. So coming out of that process, there were 4 key things that we implemented on an emergency basis in 2020 that the clerks strongly, by margins of 3, 4, 5, 6, even 10 to 1, strongly supported. Urban clerks, rural clerks, Democrats, Republicans, pretty much a consensus. So there were 4 things that we implemented into a bill. We put together a task force. Jeff was on it. I was on it. We had Democratic and Republican representatives on it. Put together a master bill, a master election reform bill, with 4 things that we did in 2020 and 3 things that we didn't do, but we thought were good ideas. And so in just a moment, I'll talk about that bill. But first, let me set the premise. Think about this for a second. The election system that I inherited when I was sworn in 18 months ago was written in 1891. 1891. Think about that. That's before cars, before electricity in homes. That's when we wrote the Kentucky Election Code. And we had not revisited it in any substantial way. I don't care what area of policy we're talking about. It's straight up malpractice to not update it for 130 years. The reason we have a legislature is to come in to town here once a year and kick the tires on our healthcare system, our education system, our economic system, all of those things, tax system, and see what should we change, what should we modernize to try to keep current with people's daily lives and their current reality, and other states for that matter. And we just had not done that with our elections, just basic inertia. We were rated 44th in election administration nationally. And let me be clear, I'm not criticizing my predecessor or any of my predecessors. They inherited an old stale system that was out of touch with modern times. And so part of what I ran to do was to update that system in ways that had consensus across the aisle, and I think we've done that. So here are the 4 things that are in this bill that we implemented on an emergency basis last year through temporarily granted emergency powers. And then I'll come back to the 3 things that are new. So first is early voting. I'm kind of a history nerd. I went back and looked at this, and in Kentucky, in our first 2 constitutions, I think our first was in, well, obviously, 1792. I think our second was in 1799, if I remember correctly. In Kentucky's first 2 constitutions, we had 4-day voting periods. Having just 1 day to vote is kind of a modern, novel, modern, I guess, 1891, but relatively novel approach. In our first 2 constitutions, we had 4-day elections. And in the current Constitution, we have a 1-day election, but with authority for the General Assembly to expand that as they choose. But the premise for a long, long time in our state was multiple days to vote. Why did they do that? Well, because we were a rural state, and it was hard for people to go vote, especially if they had to travel to the county seat in their horse and buggy. There's no reason why we should have 1 day to vote. I'm a Republican. And as you've probably seen, folks in my party have been pretty critical of the governor for his handling of unemployment. Can you imagine if the unemployment office were open just 1 day a week? Can you just imagine the backlash and the outrage? Well, why should the election system be open to you for 1 day and make you go vote on 1 day in a 12-hour span? That's not good customer service. We work for you. Y'all pay us to do this stuff. It's a right you've got in the Constitution. It's a public service taxpayers are paying for. Why would we just give you 1 day to do that? There's just not a good reason for that. What we saw last year was, especially in the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday before Election Day, a huge pop in turnout. To be clear, last year, as you remember, the polls were open for weeks at a time, and we did that to ensure social distancing and public safety. But the fact is, the way people choose to vote when they have the chance is they want to wait till the end. That's great. I got no problem with that. The odds are they're better informed if they do, because by the end, the debates are over, the campaigns have advertised, and the voters have more information at the end than they have earlier. So to me, that was the right compromise. I thought 1 day to vote was a little stingy. Hardly any state still does that today in the 21st century. But I also didn't want to have 2- and 3-week long elections for a couple of reasons. One is the cost. This is a very expensive business. Every time you got a new election day, you're multiplying your costs of running the election. And the voters just didn't really want to come out that early 2 or 3 weeks before the election. They want to wait till the end. Another reason is the campaigns are altered when the rules are changed. Obviously, we did this for neutral, good faith reasons last year, but go ask Representative Charles Booker how much he likes 2 or 3 week long elections. He surged at the end. He won Election Day, but he lost the primary election because voting was occurring over weeks before people had heard of him, before he could get up on TV. So I want rules that are fair and neutral. I don't want the rules to artificially favor well-known candidates or well-funded candidates. I think everybody ought to have a chance. So what we found was the best compromise was early voting, quadruple the number of days to vote from 1 day to 4 days. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I think especially Saturday is a game changer for working people. Let me give you a specific example. My mom. This may surprise you, but I'm kind of an outlier in my family. The rest of my family are regular folks who don't usually vote. Sometimes they do, sometimes not. They might go 2, 4, 6, 8 years without voting. They're working class people. My mom works at JCPenney in retail, and if she can't get off work, she doesn't vote. Well, this time she got to go vote because it was on a Saturday. That really helped her. My hope is that you'll see turnout increase. It maybe not immediately. It might take a couple of cycles for people to be aware of the new opportunity. But I do sincerely believe that in the next couple of elections, you're going to see our turnout in Kentucky go up significantly because we've made this easier. The second major change is optional for your county. I think y'all are probably going to do it. I'll let Jeff, of course, speak to this, so I'll just touch on it briefly. Vote centers. Vote centers are an idea that I proposed in legislation before the pandemic. Of course, the session last year was aborted. They didn't really get a chance to look at it. But I implemented this on an emergency basis through my emergency powers. Here's why I like vote centers. And they're not for everybody. That's why this is optional. What works for Franklin doesn't work for Harlan County, and vice versa. But with the vote center model, anybody in the county regardless of precinct, can go vote at any location in the county. Now, to be clear, there are fewer locations. There's a cost savings that's achieved. You need fewer poll workers. You need fewer election machines to have the same throughput of voters, but you get better locations with better parking that are more accessible to more people. I was in Boyle County a couple of months ago, not far from here. They're going to save $200,000 in taxpayer money by doing a vote center model. It's going to be just as convenient to vote as it was before, but you need fewer machines and poll workers to get voters in and out more efficiently. Speaking for myself, when I voted under the old rules in 2016 for president, it took me 3.5 hours in line to vote for the president. I saw person after person turn around and walk away. That's vote suppression. That actually is vote suppression. Long lines. With the model we used in 2020, we avoided the long lines. Of course, we had to for public health, but we avoided those long lines. It took me just 30 minutes to vote. I think that we can achieve a lot of efficiency with this model. Again, it's optional, but I think we can save money. We can make it easier for our voters. We can also re-enfranchise people that are being turned away because they go to vote at the wrong precinct. That's the number one way I've seen voters suppressed in my 30 years in politics, starting as a teenager running campaigns, and then, of course, where I am now. When I was a lawyer doing this stuff, now that I'm chief election official, folks call my office. They say, we got turned away. We went to vote, and they said, you can't vote here. Well, they were in the wrong precinct. With the vote center, you avoid that problem. Third, the absentee ballot request and tracking portal. I think this is the most important administrative reform that we did last year in several respects. One, let me walk you through how to do an absentee ballot real quick. You probably remember from last year. You got to call your clerk's office, and then the clerk's got to fill out paperwork for you. They got to mail you the paperwork. Then you got to get it in the mail. Then you got to sign it. Then you got to mail it back. We got rid of all those steps. Now you just go online yourself to our website, elect.ky.gov, and in 2 minutes, you've applied for your ballot. This gives us the ability to verify your identity electronically. It gives us the ability to eliminate unnecessary paperwork and steps, eliminate call volume on your clerks, and just arrange for that to be done more efficiently. But here's the best part. Now you can track your ballot. Most of the elections I voted in my life have been voting absentee. I'm usually traveling or tied up and can't go vote, and I vote absentee. I think it's great. But it needs to be surveilled. It needs to be monitored. This is the only part of our election that's occurring outside the purview of our election officials. I think in-person voting is the gold standard. Absentee voting is a right that's explicitly in the state constitution, so I respect that. I want to make this as available as I can, but also more secure. So now you can track your ballot 24/7. Go on our website and see where your ballot is. See, has the clerk got your request? Has the clerk issued your ballot? Has the clerk got your ballot back and your vote been counted? Those are things I would want to know, and you should too. You can track your ballot the way you track a UPS or an Amazon package. And it lets me track this stuff too, and it lets Jeff track it too. So this helps us monitor for lost or stolen absentee ballots. It helps us see if there's an address that requests multiple ballots. We can look at that and make sure it's legit. Again, it's never going to be as, I think, ideal as in-person voting, but we want to make it as secure as we possibly can. The last major change is the cure process. Think about this for a second. This is actually pretty outrageous. In 2018, 7.5% of absentee ballots were thrown in the garbage. They were just chucked with no notice to the voter. They never even knew their votes were counted. Again, I'm not criticizing anybody. That's just the law that we inherited, and we changed it. So with the cure process, now if you mail your ballot back, your absentee ballot, you got to sign the envelope. Your clerk gets it back, and if that signature doesn't match, used to be they threw your ballot out. That was the end of the story. Now they actually have to contact you and give you a chance to cure that situation. Come into the office with your ID or come in and sign whatever it is, but now you've got a path to actually get your ballot counted. This is good for access because it will help lead to votes being counted that might have been disregarded, but it's also good for security because if someone's signing your name and voting your name, I want to know about it. We didn't see any evidence of that in Kentucky. There have been some indictments brought in other states for vote fraud, impersonation matters. But I want you to know about it if someone's impersonating you. And I want to know about it too. And I want to go get an indictment on this person. So these are all things that Democrats and Republicans both utilized, things that Democrats and Republicans both liked. Other states had partisan warfare over their rules. We didn't really have that. We did stuff that just made sense and wasn't ideological. It just was practical. And all of these things increase access for voters, but they also enhance security. Very quickly, early voting enhances security for this reason. It's harder to run a vote buying operation over multiple days than it is on just one day. And it's easier for law enforcement to monitor the election when it's smoother and done over a period of time than if it's just one day of chaos, just 12 hours to vote. That was a conclusion given to me by a bipartisan task force that I've got with the state police representing the governor, with the Attorney General, with federal and state officials, FBI, USPS, Homeland Security, and that was our take. The early voting made the election more secure. So very quickly, here are 3 more things in this bill, and then I'll, of course, turn it over to Jeff. Number 1, we banned ballot harvesting. This is a very noxious practice that has been utilized in other states and here, and leads to fraud and corruption. I'll give you a specific case. Here in Kentucky, the mayor of Martin, Kentucky, was indicted and convicted and sentenced on federal charges. There were no state charges available because it wasn't illegal. It is now. Federal charges for election corruption. She was the mayor of Martin, Kentucky, in Floyd County. She used her position to pressure residents of public housing to use duress, to get them to request an absentee ballot, vote for her to be reelected under the supervision of her campaign workers. And then those folks brought the ballots back, obviously those ballots. You can see the conflict of interest when you've got outside groups or candidate representatives facilitating the voting process. It shouldn't be that way. It should be independent. So we've prohibited that. And by the way, there's no monopoly on vote fraud. There was an election in North Carolina for Congress 2 years ago. It had to be overturned because of ballot harvesting fraud, and it was the Republicans that did it. So vote fraud is not a partisan notion. We should have security against any misuse of our system. Cleaning up the voter rolls. This is an issue that I ran on, I take very seriously. I inherited voter rolls that were out of compliance with federal law, according to a federal court ruling here in Frankfort. We've worked very hard to get the rolls cleaned up. It's in no one's interest, whatever your politics, to have inaccurate government records, whether it's dead people getting stimulus checks or dead people voting. We shouldn't have that. In about half the months I've been in office, we've taken more dead voters off the rolls than we've added live voters. We've taken this very, very seriously. But there was a loophole in our law. I was not able to promptly remove voters who were still alive, but had moved to some other state and were voting in the other state and could ask for a ballot here too. You shouldn't get to vote twice. So we closed that loophole. My goal is to remove 400,000 voters from our rolls out of 3.5 million over the course of my term, and we've made great progress toward that. This legislation will help. Last point, very quickly, paper ballots. If there's any one issue that I found as I went to speak to anyone that would ever let me talk in 2019, Democrats, Republicans, anybody, the one issue I found unanimity on is people want to vote on a piece of paper and know there's a paper trail. They don't trust electronic machines. And this is a bipartisan issue. You've got Democrats that think that Russia hacked our machines in 2016 and elected Donald Trump, stole it from Hillary. I don't believe that for a second. You've got Republicans that think that the machines were hacked and the election was stolen from Governor Beshear, or for Governor Beshear from Governor Bevin. I don't believe that either. But the fact is, most voters don't really like the electronics. They want to know there's a paper trail. And I do too. And I've got my own selfish reasons, because I'm the guy that has to do a recount. I can't do a recount without ballots. If it's an electronic machine, you push the button, it says the same number. And this has actually happened. In 2018, we had a House race that was a tie, and they couldn't do a recount because there weren't ballots. With the recount law, which we now have, to make that enforceable, I got to have ballots. So this law there's a grandfather clause. It's not immediate, but as your county and every county upgrades their equipment, whether it's now, next year, or soon after that, eventually your equipment will get stale. You'll not be able to get replacement parts. This bill requires all counties to upgrade to paper ballot equipment. If there's a need for an audit, if there's a need for a recount, if there's an investigation of any sort of corruption or anything else, now we can actually go back and double check and count those votes. That's more transparency, it's more security, and it's something that everybody across the spectrum appears to believe in. With that, I want to thank you so much for your attention. I'll pass it on to Jeff. Thank you. No, I'm good.
Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce our Franklin County Clerk, Jeff Hancock. Jeff is a native of Frankfort, graduate of Frankfort High School and Morehead State University. After college, Jeff went to work for his family business, Whitehead and Hancock Plumbing, Heating, and Cooling. Since then, Jeff has been a dedicated community advocate, serving on the YMCA board, the Frankfort Chamber of Commerce, Downtown Frankfort, Frankfort Rotary, and a past president of the Frankfort Jaycees. Currently, Jeff serves on the KDLA Grant Board member, as well as the legislative committees for both KCCA and KCO. Jeff has served as the Franklin County Clerk since 2015. Before that, Jeff was a full-time realtor with Century 21 Commonwealth, where he earned his designation as one of Frankfort's top realtors for consecutive years. Jeff's married to Erica Hancock, and they have 2 children, Polly and Houston. Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Man, what a tough act to follow. I want to start by thanking the Frankfort Chamber of Commerce. You know, to understand the importance that election reform and election law has to the entire community, including the business community, is very foresightful. So thank you for having us today. I would also like to thank Secretary Adams. The first time I saw Secretary Adams talk, I thought, man, this guy is going to get eaten alive. It was at a Together Frankfort event, and we spoke together. Actually, he spoke before me. Once again, I'm the backside of the real show over here. I'm just the second in command. But I thought, we have a Republican candidate for Secretary of State in a room full of 220 Democratic females. I think he might get hung right here. And I mean, I think he's walked into, but he said something that really stuck with me that day. He said he wanted to make it easy to vote, but hard to cheat. And let me tell you this, that is exactly what Secretary Adams has done. He's made it easier for the people in this room, not only to vote, but to vote at their convenience. He has been he has taken politics and put it to the side and has been an outstanding leader for the Commonwealth. So you've got a great Secretary of State, and he's been a very, very, very great secretary to work with. I have to have notes. He doesn't have to have notes. That's not real fair. Tish Shade, Susie Burgess, Hosley, sorry, I was about to leave that part of it out, and the entire staff at the Chamber, thank you for everything you all do. The 2020 cycle was absolutely the most challenging period of my entire career. Of anything I've ever done in my life, the 2020 election cycle was not only challenging, but it was a new puzzle piece, and you could only fit the puzzle piece you had in front of you after the 2 puzzle pieces in front had already been placed. You couldn't work around, and a lot of times you didn't even know when your puzzle pieces were going to show up. We did this as an entire group. The KCCA had to think how to open a mail-in election process that we had never done in our life. We went, on average, Franklin County would mail out approximately 350 to 400 absentee ballots. In the primary for the 2020 election, we mailed out 14,752 ballots. I can tell you exactly because I had to hand put those all together, and then we had to hand open every one of those. We had to change what we thought elections looked like. We had to figure out how to keep the community safe while also allowing them every option to vote. We were all scared. You know, I was scared to death that I would take this great community in Franklin County and be an epicenter for the coronavirus. We didn't know what it was doing at that point. We were still so early in the March, April, and May process that no one knew what to do, and we were scared. I was scared that I was going to send it home with you, and that you were going to take it to your parents, to your kids, or somebody that was unable to fight it off. So fear played a big factor in how elections happened in 2020. I will say this, I'm proud of not only Franklin County, but the entire Commonwealth on how we've led this country. We've led this country with bipartisan, true bipartisan support from both sides. It was a plan that we put together, and when I say we, it was a joint effort. Everyone was at the table trying to figure out the best way that we could reform a system. And when he says 1890, well, if you look at the precincts that we had in Franklin County before this all started, there were 44 precincts in 37 locations. If you couldn't walk to a precinct, it was your fault. I mean, there were precincts everywhere. That's because when you had horse and buggy, you had to be able to get to you had to be able to get to where your main city, your main hub of your precinct was. And you had to walk, go by horse, run, however you could get there. The new election laws that have changed since the 2020 election will not only be progressive, but they will change the entire outlook. Not only will we save money, but we will make it more convenient for you and everyone else in Franklin County to vote. I put in front of you, I've shared my election plan with you. The election plan is exactly how we plan to lay out the 2022 elections. This is still a proposed plan because we have to send it to the State Board of Elections to make sure that they approve what we see as an important and versatile election setup to accommodate everyone in Franklin County. If you'll look at the map over here to the right, you see 2 stars on it. They're both our election centers. And what I want to point out from the 2 stars, one of them is the old Frankfurt Plant Board building, and the second one is the Capital City Christian Church. Now, while we chose the Capital City Christian Church as the second location for early voting, if you put a 5-mile radius around that, you pick up 75% of the population of Frankfurt and Franklin County. This gives everybody, whether they're driving to work, from work, anybody can get to one of the early voting locations. Obviously, on 2nd Street right now, you would pull your hair out if you tried to go down and early vote. Our challenges, well, let's just skip over that. We're going to have 10 total locations for the elections. We're going to have one in each magisterial district. That if you see the colors, every color is a different magisterial district from Franklin County. So we will have one in every school and an ADA accessible for every magisterial district. We also realized what complaints. We did the exact same thing the secretaries and the State Board of Election did. We listened to the complaints. And our biggest complaint were our rural areas. Our rural areas felt like they lost their representation. They lost their precinct that they could go vote to. And when I looked at it and I took a map, and a visual map really explains a lot to you. When you saw that every voting location I had, still, even though we went to every magisterial district, everything was in the southern part of the county. When you started traveling out 127 and 421, you had nothing out there. And our complaints were coming from our rural areas, Ball Knob, St. John's, Schweitzer, Swallowfield. So we've gone back out into our rural areas and we put singular election precincts out there. We've made the 2 stars voting headquarters, and then everything else you will be able to vote for your magisterial district in that area. I think the Secretary brought up a great point about 574 and voting centers. And we're close, guys. We're real close to having everything as a voting center. But there are some very small, minute changes that need to be made, and I think with some bipartisan support, and I'm kind of pushing on him at this point, we can get rid of some of the precinct language and be able to have everything as vote centers. That way, regardless where you're at, if Mary Latek is driving from one side of town to the other, and she just realizes that Western Hills is where she wants to stop in and vote because she's going to go over and talk to one of the businesses over in Prevention Park, she just pulls in, she's able to vote, nobody has any questions about it. But right now, if we did that, and I didn't go magisterial districts, every single one of those precincts would have 90-plus ballots at it during a primary election. So that's some of the reasons everybody's not a vote center. We are going to spend some money. We're going to spend approximately, and for Franklin County, it's more money than we've spent in any other election, but we're going to spend $25,000 educating the public on where they vote, how they vote, when they can vote. The early vote centers will change what you feel like is an election day. I mean, because if you're getting a full day off for election and you can go vote any day in the 4 days prior to it, you're probably going to play golf. I'm assuming that's what I would do. So we're here to help. We're here to answer. I'll be glad to answer any questions on our election plan that I can. I really appreciate, once again, Chamber. It's very foresightful to have, in a non-election year, I think she paid for everybody's lunch in the room to get everybody to show up to watch us. But we appreciate you all, and anything that we can do or any questions that we can answer, I'll be glad to.
I actually have a question. Is there a sunset period on the old voting
Well, the good news is in Franklin County, we got a $550,000 grant, and you have brand-new election equipment throughout that did not cost you, the taxpayer, $1. We applied for the grant last year in the middle of that election. I thought I was going to pull my hair out trying to do an election, and we decided to apply for a grant at the same time, but we got a grant. You have brand-new election equipment from the beginning to the end. It's all going to, and you're really going to like it as the voter. It's all printed. It's got a print-on-demand feature for, I can print the ballot there. It has a counting feature in it. It's just really, really nice equipment. Should speed up the process as well, so.
Can I address that real fast,
Yeah.
too? When I got into office, we had 29 counties that didn't have a single machine that was capable of a paper ballot. Today, all 120 counties have at least some machines that can do paper ballots. We did that because obviously the absentee was going to be a much bigger proportion. We didn't have the technology for it, so we had to upgrade fast. Our office pursued and obtained about $12.5 million. A lot of that went for PPE. A lot of that went to cover counties' costs for paying premiums to poll workers because we had trouble getting poll workers. But a lot of that, actually most of that went toward the actual equipment itself, the actual process itself. We've got some money left over. We're going to keep helping our counties upgrade their machines. Let me speak to this just real fast. I want to explain what the machines are, because there's been some concern about the election machines and what they do, what vulnerability they have. Let me be very clear. There are going to be two types of election machines. One is literally a counter. It's like what you have in the high school to count Scantron tests, multiple choice tests. It's not on the internet. Our stuff now isn't on the internet. This won't be either. It's just a counter. It doesn't plug anything except the wall. It's just a counter. It's like I used to be a bank teller when I was working my way through college, and you put the money in there and it counts the money. This is all it is. It's just a counter. That's one kind of machine that counts paper ballots filled out by hand. The other machine is also electronic in the sense that it has a screen that you look at, you pick your candidate, but it's not a voting machine. It's actually a printer. You walk into the booth, you close the curtain, you pick who you're going to vote for, and you push a button. It doesn't say vote. It says print. You print your ballot. And then you have a ballot just like every other ballot, like a hand-filled ballot, only it's filled out by the printer. It lets the voter verify the accuracy of the votes, so no one can say, oh, my votes were changed or whatever. And then it goes into the same counter machine as all the other ballots. And I have to say this because unfortunately there's some misinformation out there about this bill, about what we do in Kentucky, and I just want to set that record straight. Thanks so much.
I have a question. So obviously with the absentee ballots, in 2020 was, health concerns. But moving forward, are there going to be certain requirements to be able to get an absentee ballot, or can anyone still request one?
Well, there's misinformation on this too. I'm glad you asked that question. Kentucky did not make it harder to vote. Despite some, it's funny, back in April when we passed this bill, it was a man bites dog story, and we got national attention, national praise. I was called to Congress to testify about it. Great news. But because of what other states are doing, there's some truth to it. There's a narrative building that states are trying to make it harder to vote, and there's a backlash. Well, unfortunately, they've been including Kentucky in their count of these states that are making it harder to vote. In no way did this law in any way alter absentee voting in terms of who can or can't get a ballot. All the reasons that were previously in our Constitution and previously in our statutes are still there. They weren't adjusted upwards or downwards. Zero difference. So there's about a dozen or so different reasons in our code that you can vote absentee. Your age. And by the way, the law says age. It doesn't say what your age is. There's no artificial arbitrary cutoff. If you as the voter feel like your age prevents you from voting in person, then you can vote absentee. Age, disability, out of town on election day. That will be changed to out of town on the days that there's in-person voting. So if you're out of town all 4 of those days, right, not just one. But otherwise, there's really been no change whatsoever to the law. There's been kind of a moving of the goalposts. We didn't have no excuse absentee last year. We had COVID excuse absentee. COVID's a pretty darn good excuse to have absentee voting. But COVID is going away. We don't think that when people vote again, it will be there. So there's not really a rationale to have that the primary way that people vote. It costs twice as much per ballot to vote that way as it does to vote in person. What I believe and what I persuaded the legislature of is the best way to expand access to the franchise is to expand in-person voting instead of absentee. It certainly costs a lot less, but also look at what the voters want. Even in a pandemic, when we made absentee voting available to anybody, even in a pandemic, 70% of voters chose to vote in person instead. So let's just respect our constituents and their preferences. It saves taxpayer money. Thanks.
Susie, I want to cover that a little bit. Franklin County could not afford for us to do another mail-by vote. When he talks about the cost of it, the state picked up the envelopes, they picked up the mailing cost. If we had to pick that up today, you're talking about just for Franklin County alone, you're talking about a $50,000 loss if we chose to vote that way again. And with 574, the state's not picking up any of the costs for the envelopes. They're not picking up any of the costs for the mailing. They're not picking up any of that. So it would be absolutely impossible without some different structure to be able to even afford to do it.
Knowing that we don't know what we don't know, are there contingency plans to pivot in the event the future lays out something again that we don't know? COVID was something we did not know was going to happen to us. So we now have had to adjust to that. Have we built in safety nets and safe gaps for the future in the event we have a situation that causes us to have to go to absentee ballot to that scale?
Well, not specifically, but that's true of really every area of policy. The solution is that the governor has the power to call a special session and the law to be changed to allow for whatever needs to be different. But there's nothing in our law that has an escape clause that changes the election rules if X or Y happens. But the governor has emergency powers, and one of those powers is not an emergency power. It's just he can call the legislature back and propose that they change the law to make a modification. One thing that I think is a reason why our elections were less disputatious than what you saw in some other states is that in other states, for I'm sure various internal political reasons, people in my position did not go to the legislature and request permission to make alterations. I did. And I think that's why it was less contentious here, is I went and I asked for permission instead of just changing stuff on my own and claiming authority under the Constitution. And when I did that, I explicitly asked the legislature, controlled by my party, to make sure that the governor was included in that. I thought it would be a bad look if the new Secretary of State shows up in Frankfurt and gets the bill passed to give himself all the power to run the election his own way. The Democrats would have gone nuts, and they would have been right to. It also would have been a problem if only the governor had this power and as a Democrat, then the Republicans would have cried foul. So I think one thing that we've really gotten right is we've done it in a bipartisan way. The legislature expanded the governor's emergency powers. For all the combat over that, they actually expanded his emergency powers and mine as well to let us fix this. But one thing that they didn't like, legislatures didn't like, is you had the executive branch essentially, with permission, sure, but the executive branch making the policy decisions. And they weren't fond of that on the election front, on the COVID front, and otherwise. So the solution going forward will simply be for the governor to call them back into session and then reach some sort of agreement about what has to change. Thanks.
Any other questions? You all have anything else you'd like to say?
I think I'm good.
All right, well, I just want to thank you all for coming out today. I want to thank the secretary and Jeff for taking the time to come out and speak to us. And, as always, the Frankfurt Chamber is here for us, businesses, and if you guys have anything else, we'd love to hear from you. And if not, we'll see you at the next event.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
so much. Thank you, this has been great. Thank you, my pleasure.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your kind comments. Thank you.
Well, you do a good job.